The eviction notice sat on the kitchen counter between us. Not a legal document, just a handwritten note on lined paper torn from a spiral notebook. Dad needs to find other arrangements by the end of the month. Marcus had signed it with his usual sprawling signature, the kind that takes up 3 times more space than necessary. My daughter Sarah stood at the sink with her back to both of us, washing the same plate over and over, the water running long after the soap had rinsed away. I folded the paper once, then twice, and slipped it into my shirt pocket. The whole thing took maybe 30 seconds. Marcus was already walking towards the garage, keys jingling against his phone in that careless way people move when they believe they have won something. I had been living in their guest room for 7 months. Not long in the grand scheme. Long enough to see how a marriage works when no one is performing for company. Sarah finally turned off the water. Her hands were red from the heat. She dried them on a towel that had been white once, methodically, 1 finger at a time. When she looked at me, her eyes were careful, the way they had been since her mother's funeral, like she was always measuring distances and deciding what could be safely said. "I'll start looking tomorrow," I told her. She nodded, the towel twisted in her hands. "He's just stressed about work." I had heard that phrase perhaps 50 times in 7 months. Each time it carried a little less conviction. The morning after Ellen died, I had stood in our bedroom and understood that the house where we had raised Sarah, where I had carried my bride across the threshold 36 years prior, had become a museum of routines I could no longer perform alone. The coffee maker that required 2 hands, because Ellen always made fun of my inability to pour straight. The garden she had tended with a precision I never learned. The second pillow that still held the depression of her head. Sarah had found me there 3 days later, standing in the kitchen at 2 in the afternoon, unable to remember if I had eaten. She had packed a bag for me without asking. Marcus had said all the right things about family and support and plenty of space. His handshake had been firm. His smile had reached his eyes, or close enough. The guest room was 12 by 10. Blue walls. A double bed with a quilt Ellen had made years ago, one Sarah must have found in storage. A dresser with 6 drawers, though I only needed 3. A window that looked onto their backyard, where a wooden playset sat unused, its slide faded by sun, its swings hanging still on windless days. Sarah and Marcus had no children. The playset had been there when they bought the house, and Marcus kept saying he would dismantle it for firewood, but never did. I spent many mornings watching it through that window, drinking coffee, listening to the house wake around me. Marcus worked in commercial real estate. Development, he called it, though the details remained vague even after months of dinners where he held court about deals and leverage and market corrections. He was 41, 11 years older than Sarah, and he wore that gap like a medal. His hair was still thick and dark. His car was German and new. He had opinions about wine that he delivered with the confidence of someone who had never been told he was wrong about anything that mattered. Sarah had met him at a hospital fundraiser where she volunteered on weekends. He had been there as a donor, the kind who arrives late and leaves early, but makes sure his name appears on the program in a larger font. She was 30 then, working as a teacher's aide and living in a 1-bedroom apartment she could barely afford. He pursued her with flowers and expensive dinners and a kind of focused attention that can feel like love when you have been invisible for a long time. They married within a year. Ellen had smiled through the wedding, but said little. Afterward, in the car, she had reached over and squeezed my hand, and I understood we were both thinking the same thing, but would never say it aloud. The first weeks in their home had been careful. I stayed out of the way. I learned Marcus's schedule and made sure I was either in my room or outside when he returned from work. I cooked occasionally, simple things, and always cleaned immediately after. I offered to pay rent. Marcus waved it away with theatrical generosity. "Family does not pay rent," he said. Sarah had looked relieved. I had nodded and thanked him, and filed the interaction away in the part of my mind that tracks debts and power. By month 3, the performance had worn thin. Marcus began leaving dishes in the sink, looking pointedly at me when he did. He started comments about the thermostat, the grocery bills, the noise of my morning routine. Small things, delivered casually, always when Sarah was in another room. I adjusted. I woke earlier, moved quieter, ate less. It made no difference. The problem was not my behavior. The problem was my presence. Sarah tried to create buffers. She scheduled errands during Marcus's home hours. She invented reasons for me to visit neighbors I barely knew. She cooked meals that required long preparation times, keeping us all occupied with tasks that prevented conversation. I watched her expend herself in these small martyrdoms and said nothing because I understood she was trying to hold something together that had already fractured, possibly long before I arrived. The note appeared on a Tuesday morning. Marcus had left for work an hour earlier than usual. Sarah had not come down for breakfast. I found the paper next to the coffee maker, propped against the sugar bowl where it could not be missed. The handwriting was neat, almost calligraphic in its precision. 30 days. Other arrangements, signature. No explanation, no softening clause, no acknowledgement of what those 7 months had meant or cost. I had spent 37 years managing a small manufacturing plant, the kind of operation that employed 60 people and ran on thin margins and required constant attention to detail and morale. I knew when a decision had already been made, and when resistance would only create additional damage. I folded the note and waited for Sarah to come downstairs, and when she did, moving slowly, her eyes already red, I made the decision easy for her. I would start looking tomorrow. She did not have to choose between us. I was already choosing for both of us. That afternoon, I drove to the public library. I had not been inside in years. The building had been renovated since Ellen's time. New computers lined the walls. A coffee shop had appeared where the card catalog used to be. I sat at a terminal in the back corner and opened a browser and began searching rental listings in the area. 1-bedroom apartments within 10 miles, price range modest, available immediately. The results filled 3 pages. Most were complex units with central air and shared laundries and walls thin enough to hear your neighbor's television. I scrolled through them with growing detachment, trying to imagine myself in those spaces. Failing. Then I switched searches. Homes for sale, same radius. My price range was more flexible than Marcus knew. Ellen and I had lived carefully. The life insurance had been substantial. The house had sold for more than expected. I had savings, investments, a pension that arrived with reliable punctuality. I was not wealthy, but I was not without resources. The house appeared on page 2 of the results. Colonial style. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, built in 1987. The address made me sit forward. I knew that street. I knew that exact location. It was next door to Sarah and Marcus. The house on the left side, the one with the cedar siding and the deep front porch. The listing had been active for 40 days. The price had dropped twice. The photos showed empty rooms with clean carpets and neutral walls. The yard needed work, but had good bones. A for sale sign stood visible in the front lawn, weathered but legible. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called the listing agent. Her name was Rebecca Malone. She answered on the second ring with the practiced warmth of someone who makes her living managing other people's biggest decisions. I explained I was interested in the property, that I had cash for a significant down payment, that I would like to see it that afternoon if possible. Her warmth became genuine. She could meet me in an hour. The house was smaller than I remembered from the outside. Standing in the driveway, looking up at it, I could see Sarah and Marcus's home clearly over the low fence that divided the properties. Their kitchen window faced this direction. If Sarah stood at the sink, the place she spent so much time, she would be able to see directly into what would become my living room. Rebecca arrived in a silver sedan, all business suit and clipboard. She shook my hand firmly and opened the lockbox with practiced efficiency. The interior smelled of fresh paint and emptiness. The floors were hardwood, recently refinished. The kitchen was dated but functional. The bedrooms were modest. The basement was dry and well lit. I walked through each room slowly, opening closets, testing faucets, looking out windows. Rebecca followed at a respectful distance, offering facts about heating systems and property taxes and neighborhood comps. I was barely listening. I was calculating sight lines and measuring the psychology of proximity. "The previous owners relocated for work," Rebecca said as we stood in the master bedroom. "They maintained it well. It won't last long at this price." "I'll make an offer," I said. "Today. Full asking price. Cash sale. 30-day closing." She blinked. "I'll need to draw up paperwork. Let's do it now." We sat at her car and filled out forms on the hood, using the clipboard as a desk. I provided bank statements I had brought with me, references, documentation of funds. Rebecca kept glancing at me as if trying to reconcile my age and calm demeanor with the speed of the transaction. When everything was signed, she promised to submit it immediately and said I should hear back within 24 hours. I thanked her and drove back to Sarah's house, parked in the guest spot I had been using for 7 months, and went inside to begin packing. Sarah found me an hour later, folding shirts into a cardboard box. She stood in the doorway of the guest room, arms crossed, watching me work. I could feel the question forming, the one she was not sure she wanted answered. "Where are you going?" she finally asked. "I found a place," I said. "Close by. You won't have to worry." "Dad." Her voice cracked on the single syllable. "You don't have to leave. I can talk to him." I set down the shirt I was holding and looked at her directly. "Yes, I do. And no, you can't." She opened her mouth and closed it again. Her hands twisted together, the same motion I had seen 1,000 times since childhood, whenever she was trapped between truth and comfort. "It's a good place," I continued, returning to the packing. 3 bedrooms, good bones. I'll be fine." She did not ask where. She did not push further. She stood there another minute, then turned and walked back downstairs, and I heard the television click on in the living room, the volume slightly too loud, the way people use noise to fill spaces that have become unbearable. The offer was accepted by noon the next day. The sellers were motivated. The paperwork moved with unusual speed. Rebecca called every few days with updates, her voice increasingly cheerful as the deal progressed without complications. I met with inspectors, reviewed reports, signed documents. I said nothing to Sarah or Marcus about the location. When Sarah asked which apartment complex I had chosen, I told her it was still being finalized. When Marcus asked in passing, with the disinterest of someone checking a box, I said I had found something suitable and changed the subject. I moved my belongings gradually, a box to the storage unit I rented, another box the next day. Clothes, books, the few items I had brought that carried weight, Ellen's photo in its silver frame, the quilt from our bed, my father's watch. I worked methodically, like I was closing a factory floor at the end of a shift, making sure nothing important was left behind. The closing happened on a Thursday morning at a title company downtown. I sat across from the sellers, a young couple in their 30s with matching wedding bands and matching exhausted expressions. They had twin toddlers at home, they explained, and the new job was in another state, and they were grateful for a quick sale. I shook their hands and signed page after page, initialing here and here and here, watching my savings convert into ownership. The keys were presented in a small envelope. Rebecca shook my hand with genuine pleasure. The couple drove away. I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, holding the envelope, feeling the weight of what I had done settle into clarity. I drove to the house, my house, and parked in the driveway. The for sale sign was still up. I would need to call Rebecca about that. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The afternoon light came through the windows at angles that would take time to learn. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps loud on the hardwood, and stopped in what would be my living room. Through the window, I could see Sarah and Marcus's house. The kitchen window. The backyard with its unused playset. The driveway where Marcus parked his German car with careless confidence. I had not bought the house for revenge. That required a kind of heat I no longer possessed. I had bought it because my daughter was trapped in a marriage to a man who measured worth by inconvenience, who had taken her gratitude and twisted it into obligation, who would eventually turn the same casual cruelty he had shown me toward her. I had bought it because proximity is a form of witness, and witness is a form of protection. And because when that day came, when Marcus's arrogance finally outpaced his caution, I wanted to be close enough to see it clearly and act accordingly. I spent the next 2 weeks moving in properly. I hired a truck for the furniture I had in storage. I bought a couch and a kitchen table and a bed from a local furniture outlet, practical pieces with clean lines and neutral colors. I set up the guest room as an office. I unpacked boxes and arranged books on shelves, and hung Ellen's photo in the living room, where I would see it every morning. I did all of this quietly, without announcement, letting the activity speak for itself. The day I put up my mailbox with my name on it, Sarah saw it. I was tightening the screws when I heard her voice behind me, sharp with confusion. "Dad, what are you doing?" I turned. She was standing on the property line, still in her work clothes, a canvas bag over her shoulder, staring at the house and the mailbox and me like she had stumbled into an alternate dimension. "I live here now," I said simply. "Here?" She gestured at the house, then at her own house, then back again. "Next door?" "Yes." How did you? She stopped, recalibrating. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I wanted it to be certain first," I said. "The closing only finalized last week." She looked at the house again, processing. A dozen emotions crossed her face too quickly to name. Then Marcus appeared in their driveway, home early from work, his tie already loosened. He saw us talking, saw where I was standing, and his face performed its own calculation. He walked over with the deliberate stride of someone asserting territory. "What's going on?" he said, directing the question to Sarah but looking at me. "Dad bought this house," Sarah said quietly. "He's living here now." Marcus's expression froze. "This house? Next door?" "Yes," I said. "You're kidding." "No." A silence opened between us. Marcus was working through implications, his jaw tight, his hands flexing. He wanted to say something cutting, something that would re-establish the power dynamic that my eviction was supposed to have cemented. But we were standing on my property now. I owned this ground. The geometry had changed. "Well," he finally said, forcing a laugh that fooled no one. "That's certainly convenient." "I thought so," I said mildly. He looked at Sarah, expecting her to share his discomfort, his outrage, something. She was staring at the house with an expression I could not read. Marcus waited another beat, then turned and walked back toward their house, his shoulders rigid, his stride just slightly too fast. Sarah stayed. She looked at me with those careful eyes, and I could see her trying to decide if this was a gift or a punishment, protection or surveillance. I'm not here to interfere, I said before she could ask. I'm here because you're my daughter, and this is where you are. She nodded slowly. He's not going to like this. I know. It's going to make things harder. Maybe, I said. Or maybe it will make certain things impossible that should never have been possible in the first place. She looked at me for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. Some small allowance of relief she had not known she was carrying. Then she turned and followed Marcus inside, and I went back to tightening the screws on my mailbox, making sure my name was clearly visible from the street. The first month of living next door established new patterns. I kept a routine. I woke early, made coffee, read the paper on my front porch. I tended the yard, gradually bringing it back from neglect. I planted annuals along the walkway, trimmed the hedges, repaired the small fence that divided our properties. I was visible, but not intrusive. I waved when I saw Sarah. I nodded when I saw Marcus. I did not drop by unannounced. I did not ask questions about their life. I simply existed in parallel, a constant peripheral presence that could not be ignored or dismissed. Marcus hated it. I could see it in the way he avoided eye contact, the way he parked his car at angles that blocked his view of my house, the way he came and went through the garage instead of the front door. He had wanted me gone, erased, reduced to an occasional phone call on holidays. Instead, I was 15 feet away, separated only by a fence and the thin pretense of privacy. Sarah began visiting. Small trips at first, borrowing a cup of sugar, asking about a recipe Ellen used to make, standing on my porch for 10 minutes, then 20, then an hour, talking about work and weather and nothing important. I never pressed. I let her set the pace. Sometimes she would glance back at her house with a nervous expression, as if Marcus might appear and demand she explain herself. He never did. Whatever he was feeling, he kept it internal, compressed, waiting. 2 months in, the first crack appeared. I was working in my front yard one Saturday morning when I heard raised voices from next door. The windows were open. Marcus's voice carried, sharp and accusatory. Sarah's responses were quieter, defensive. I could not make out specific words, but tone communicates more than content. This was not a discussion. This was a verdict being delivered. The front door slammed. Marcus stormed to his car and drove away with more speed than the residential street warranted. I continued working, pruning the hedge, giving Sarah time. 20 minutes later, she came outside and sat on my porch steps without asking permission. Her eyes were red. "Want to talk about it?" I asked, setting down the shears. "Not really," she said. Then, after a silence, "Money. It's always about money lately." I waited. "He made some investments that didn't work out," she continued, her voice flat. "He says it's temporary. He says the market always corrects. He keeps saying that. The market always corrects." "How much?" I asked gently. She shook her head. "He won't tell me exactly, but he's been taking money from our joint account, a lot, and he's angry that I noticed." I sat down beside her on the steps. "Are you in trouble?" "I don't know. He says no. But he's been weird, secretive, staying late at work, coming home in bad moods and taking it out on—" She stopped. "On you," I finished. She did not confirm or deny. She pulled her knees to her chest, making herself smaller, and stared across the street at nothing. "I'm here," I said quietly. "Whatever you need. However this goes. I'm right here." She nodded without looking at me. We sat like that for a long time, not speaking, just being present for each other in the way family does when words have stopped being useful. Eventually she stood, thanked me for listening, and went back inside her house. I watched her go, then picked up my shears and finished the hedge with more force than necessary. Over the next weeks, I began paying closer attention. I was not spying. I was observing, the way you observe when someone you love is in danger but cannot yet admit it. I noticed Marcus leaving earlier and returning later. I noticed expensive packages arriving and then disappearing. I noticed Sarah's car was gone during times she should have been home. I noticed the lights in their house staying on past midnight, and sometimes voices raised late, and once something breaking, glass or ceramic, followed by silence. I did what I could from a distance. I made sure my porch light stayed on. I made sure my car was visibly parked. I made sure Sarah knew my door was unlocked and my phone was always on. I was constructing a safety net she had not asked for but would eventually need. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in November. I was reading in my living room when I heard the shouting, loud enough to carry through walls. Marcus's voice, raw with fury. Sarah's voice, raised in response but shaking. The sound of doors slamming. Then Marcus's car starting and tearing out of the driveway, gravel spitting. I set down my book and waited. 5 minutes. 10. Then a knock on my door, soft and tentative. I opened it to find Sarah standing there with a small overnight bag, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Can I stay here tonight?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," I said, stepping aside. She came in and sat on my couch and started crying, and I let her because sometimes that is the only reasonable response to a situation that has become unreasonable. When she could speak again, the story came out in pieces. Marcus had lost far more money than she had realized. The investments were not just bad, they were reckless. He had borrowed against their house without telling her. He had maxed out credit cards in her name. He had lied about contracts, about clients, about deals that never existed. The facade had finally collapsed under its own weight, and when she confronted him with the bank statements she had found, he had turned mean in a way she had never seen before. Not physically violent, but close enough to frightening. Words meant to wound. Threats meant to control. And she had grabbed a bag and left because staying felt dangerous in a way she could not articulate, but knew in her bones. I made tea. I offered the guest room. I told her she could stay as long as she needed. I did not say "I told you so," or "I saw this coming," or any of the things that would have been true but unhelpful. I just made space for her to breathe and think and decide what came next without pressure. She stayed 3 days. We fell into a quiet routine. She used my kitchen to cook meals she did not have to share. She slept late for the first time in months. She walked around the neighborhood without a destination, just moving to prove she could. And gradually, the trembling stopped, and the color returned to her face. And she started talking about lawyers and bank accounts and the practical logistics of separation. Marcus came by on the second day. He knocked on my door with the kind of force that announced anger before any words could. I opened it, but did not invite him in. "I need to talk to Sarah," he said. "She doesn't want to talk to you," I replied calmly. "She's my wife. She's my daughter, and she asked to stay here. So that's what's happening." He took a step forward, trying to use his height, his age, his presumed authority. I did not move. I had spent decades managing conflicts between men who thought volume and proximity were arguments. I knew how to stand my ground without escalation. "You've been poisoning her against me since you moved in," he said, his voice low and venomous. "No," I said. "You did that yourself. I just gave her a place to land when she finally had enough." His jaw worked, his hands flexed. For a moment I thought he might try something physical, and I was prepared to respond accordingly. But he was smarter than that. He knew assault would finish whatever fragments remained of his life. So he spat an insult, turned, and walked back to his house, slamming his door hard enough that I heard it from across the yard. Sarah moved forward with legal proceedings. She hired a family attorney who specialized in financial misconduct in marriage. The documentation Marcus had tried to hide came to light, page by page, transaction by transaction. The picture was worse than she had feared. He had gambled their future on a series of increasingly desperate deals, each meant to recover the losses from the last. A classic spiral. The house was mortgaged to the limit. The credit cards were ruined. The retirement accounts were emptied. He had built a pyramid of debt and fantasy and rage, and now it was collapsing on top of him. I provided Sarah with what help I could. A room without judgment, meals without expectation, silence when she needed it, and conversation when she did not. I also provided something else: distance. Because she was next door, she could rebuild without running. She could take meetings with lawyers and accountants in my dining room and then walk home to feed the plants and collect the mail and maintain the appearance of normalcy while the actual structure of her marriage dismantled behind closed doors. Marcus tried various approaches. Apologies delivered through text messages, flowers left on her car, promises of change, therapy, financial recovery. When those failed, he tried anger. He accused her of betrayal, of abandoning him in his time of need, of listening to her father instead of her husband. When that failed, he tried bargaining. He would sell the house. He would find new work. He would fix everything if she just came back. Sarah listened to all of it with the patience of someone who had finally seen the pattern clearly and could no longer be convinced it was anything other than what it was. The divorce took 6 months. It was not amicable, but it was final. The house sold quickly, despite the market conditions. The debts were divided according to formulas I did not fully understand, but Sarah's attorney assured were fair. Marcus moved to another state, taking a job with a smaller firm at a fraction of his previous salary. He sent a final text message to Sarah before he left, something about regret and missed chances. She read it once and deleted it. The house next door went back on the market. I thought about buying it, adding it to my holdings, but that felt like overreach. Instead, I watched as a young family moved in, couple in their early 30s with 2 small children who immediately took ownership of the abandoned playset in the backyard. Their laughter carried over the fence, and sometimes I would see them from my window, pushing their children on the swings, and think about cycles and what breaks them and what begins after. Sarah did not move back in with me. She found an apartment downtown, smaller than she was used to, but entirely hers. She took a full-time teaching position, something she had always wanted, but Marcus had discouraged because the pay was less than her aid work. She started calling regularly, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to. She visited on Sundays for breakfast, sitting on my porch with coffee, talking about her students and her plans, and the life she was building from the ground up. I asked her once if she regretted any of it. The marriage, the years, the cost. She thought for a long time before answering. "I regret staying as long as I did," she finally said. "But I don't regret leaving when I did, and I don't regret that you were here when I needed somewhere to go." I told her that was why I had bought the house. Not to intrude, not to control, just to be close enough to matter when it counted. She smiled, the first real smile I had seen in months, and said, "I know." We sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the neighborhood move through its afternoon routines, and I thought about Ellen and how she would have approved of this version of things. Not the pain that led to it, but the outcome. The daughter safe, the father present, the boundary between protection and interference finally calibrated correctly. Marcus sent one final message, months later, to my email address. I do not know how he got it. perhaps from some old contact list, perhaps from public records associated with the house purchase. The message was short. It said I had destroyed his marriage and ruined his life, and he hoped I was satisfied with myself. I read it once and did not reply. There was nothing to say. He had destroyed his own marriage through 100 small choices made over years, each one compounding the last. I had simply been there to catch what fell when it finally broke. I forwarded the message to Sarah's attorney, who confirmed it would be kept on file but advised no response. Then I deleted it and went back to my life, which had settled into a rhythm I found sustainable. Morning coffee, yard work, reading, cooking simple meals, visits with Sarah, the occasional dinner with the neighbors, whose children sometimes knocked on my door to ask if I wanted to see what they had built or drawn or discovered in the backyard. The house itself became more than shelter. It became proof of a principle I had operated by my entire adult life: that patience is a strategy, that proximity is power, and that sometimes the best way to fight for someone you love is not to fight at all, but to position yourself carefully and wait for the right moment to act. I had bought the house not knowing exactly how events would unfold, but trusting that being close mattered. And it had. When Sarah needed somewhere to go, I was 15 feet away instead of 15 miles. When she needed witness to her suffering, I was right there seeing it clearly. When she needed permission to leave, I had already modeled what it looked like to remove yourself from an untenable situation with dignity intact. I think about Marcus sometimes, in whatever city he landed in, starting over with diminished prospects and the bitter knowledge that his arrogance cost him everything. I do not celebrate his downfall. It brings me no pleasure, but I do not regret my part in it either. He made his choices. I made mine. The consequences fell where they were always going to fall. Sarah thrives now in ways both small and profound. She teaches 4th grade at a school she loves. She dates occasionally, carefully, with standards she did not have before. She talks about maybe buying her own house someday, something small with a yard she can tend herself. She mentions this while sitting on my porch, drinking coffee, the late afternoon sun falling across both our properties, and I nod and tell her it sounds like a good plan, knowing that wherever she goes, I will always keep a room ready and a light on. The neighbors' children grow louder and more adventurous. Their playset sees constant use now. I watch them sometimes from my living room window, the same window through which I once watched Sarah standing at her kitchen sink, washing the same plate over and over, trapped in a marriage she could not yet name as a cage. The children are fearless in the way children should be, swinging high, sliding fast, their laughter rising into the evening air like a promise that some cycles do break and new ones do begin. I am 73 years old. My health is good. My mind is clear. I have the financial security to live comfortably for whatever years remain. But more than that, I have the satisfaction of knowing I positioned myself correctly at the moment that mattered most. When my daughter needed me, I was not a phone call away or a highway away or a burden asking permission to exist. I was next door. I was present. I was ready. That, in the end, is what the house represents. Not revenge or spite or territorial victory, just proximity, just presence, just the quiet. Certainty that when the people you love are in danger, the best strategy is often the simplest one. Be close enough to see what is happening, to act when action is required, and to provide shelter when the storm finally breaks. Marcus gave me 30 days to find other arrangements. I used that time to buy the house next door and wait. It took longer than 30 days for his life to unravel, but not much longer. Arrogance always outpaces caution eventually. I just had to be patient enough to let it happen and close enough to protect Sarah when it did. The eviction notice is still in my desk drawer, folded twice, yellowed at the creases. I keep it not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that being dismissed does not mean being defeated, that being told you are inconvenient does not mean you are powerless, and that sometimes the best response to being kicked out is not to go far, but to go right next door and wait for clarity to arrive. Sarah is safe, the house is mine, the principle is proven. And on Sunday mornings, when I sit on my porch with coffee and watch the neighborhood wake, I feel something close to peace. Not the peace of a life without conflict, but the peace of a conflict handled correctly, with patience and precision, and just enough strategic positioning to make a difference when it counted. Ellen would have approved. I can almost hear her saying it, the way she used to when I worried I had made a mistake or overstepped or failed to see something obvious. "You did fine," she would say, that gentle firmness in her voice that meant the discussion was over and the outcome was acceptable. "You did exactly fine." And I think she would be right. I bought a house next door. I stayed close. I waited. And when my daughter needed me, I was there. Simple as that. Simple and sufficient and exactly what was required. That is enough.